Welcome to this second video on week 2, where we'll be focusing a bit on the readings. In this segment, I'd like to just make a few observations on some of the things we're looking at. We'll be looking at a couple of chapters from Green, Hearing the New Testament, and on Witherington's book on rhetoric, both of which you'll be reading from this week. In Green's introductory chapter, he talks broadly about issues relating to communication. One of the things he highlights is the issue of ambiguity, and especially how in written form we lack the immediate mechanisms to clarify. You can compare this to a coffeehouse conversation where someone says something, you say, "Eh, what do you mean? I didn't get that." In writing, you don't have that. So that lends itself to certain kinds of ambiguities and difficulties in communication. I will observe here that, at least from my perspective, there are some deliberate ambiguities in communication. That is, sometimes we deliberately obscure things for a reason. Even in biblical texts, I could give some examples, but perhaps we'll leave those for a discussion later if you're curious. Not always, of course, but in some cases, ambiguity can be a tool for communication. So we'd be surprised if biblical authors never used it. When we can discern those ambiguities, we need to respect them. So, as I've got this, what happens in vagueness stays in vagueness. So when there is ambiguity, we ought to honor it and seek to understand why it's there, not try to obliterate it, is I guess my simple point. There are a variety of different types of ambiguities within texts. You can look, for example, William Emerson's classic little book on poetry, 7 Types of Ambiguities, where he talks about different literary ways in which ambiguity contributes to the meaning of poetry. It's a good discussion. It's worth looking at. It's a short little book, but it will illuminate, I think, some of these issues in kind of helpful ways. Poets especially use ambiguity because often they want to be elusive. They want you to reflect, consider, make connections between things, but they do it more suggestively rather than directly. And if they just told you this is what this is about, it would be kind of boring. So anyway, this is one example of a text, and there are a number of others I could refer you to if you're interested in more on ambiguity. There are also ambiguities that arise because of different vocabularies. We use different words, or maybe use them from different contexts, different settings, different historical and cultural backgrounds. So, for example, even in interpersonal relationships, should you bow, should you shake your hand? There's an ambiguity, and sometimes what you're doing isn't always understandable to the other person. So that's some of the things we want to think about. The fact of ambiguity, even in Scripture, whether it was introduced by the author or just exists because of those differences, it seems to me obvious and compelling. People who believe in the inerrancy, the authority, and all that of Scripture reach strikingly different conclusions on individual texts and even doctrines sometimes, right? Even when they share conclusions on historical background, use the same lexicons, and even use the same hermeneutics texts. Or to be specific, a book like Revelation is so variously interpreted in its details. Even within each of its respective interpretive schools, the 4 major schools, historicist and idealist and futurist and preterist, all that, even within those various schools, the variety is striking that I'm not sure there's unanimity about any individual passage in the book, let alone any sections. Although we all agree that Revelation says God wins and encourages believers to persevere in the light of that future hope. You can see some of that if you go, for example, to Steve Gregg's Revelation 4 Views of Parallel Commentary. You can see the diversity just in those columns. Everyone has different interpretations, and within each column there are variations as well. And it's like, is there anything that everyone agrees on? So somehow there's some sort of ambiguity, even if it's not introduced by the author, even if it's just a product of distance and all of that. Some interpretation and diversity in our conclusions simply arises out of these realities. We evaluate these ambiguities, I think, in light of our background, our theological tradition, and so on. We can discuss this more if you like, but the point is, when we come across these ambiguous things, how do we resolve those ambiguities? Well, we draw on the things that to us seem less ambiguous, our theological framework, our church or ecclesial background, or some other factors that are personal and perspectival to some extent, right? So that's part of why we reach different conclusions. Even if we say we're using grammatical historical methods, we all agree on historical background, we're using the same research tools and all of that. So ambiguity, a big issue that's not often thought about in terms of hermeneutics. Green introduces one other factor which supplements these observations about ambiguity. His comments about readers being more or less practiced. His point here is one worth exploring. There are competent readers and incompetent ones. Teachers learn this quickly. Some of your students will read the text and get it. Some will read it and get exactly the wrong thing. Many hermeneutical discussions in the past few decades include discussions of the ideal reader, or perhaps the virtuous reader, which is connected to this point. We might think of hermeneutics as a skill, or a craft, or a trade, which doesn't just come automatically, right? One doesn't become a good carpenter merely by memorizing rules or following step-by-step instructions. You can be generally competent in building things like IKEA furniture that way, but you probably won't build a beautiful rocking chair. That's just the reality. The goal of hermeneutics is not necessarily to learn a set of rules, but to learn how to practice the discipline of hermeneutics, of biblical interpretation. How to best become a reader is a part of our task and what we wish to share with our students. So again, I think oftentimes we are very cognitive and principial and all of that. Sometimes the best way to teach hermeneutics is to actually get your hands dirty and to do it in class, right? Have people interpret passages, wrestle with a text. They learn more, students learn more by doing that than by memorizing 5 principles of what they should do and all of that. That's a kind of a pedagogical principle, but it's worth noting a lot of hermeneutics classes spend very little time actually working with texts. And that's unfortunate because that doesn't develop the skills or the habits or the dispositions necessary to be a good interpreter. In Chapter 3, there are some discussions of historical criticism and social science criticism. Historical criticism has been kind of a dominant paradigm in the academy over the last few decades, maybe the last century or so, and still holds sway in many ways, with some helpful contributions and some real problems, especially when this method is linked to a robust anti-supernaturalism, which is too often the case. I especially value the theological point that historical criticism demands there is something outside the text, even when that's implied tepidly, an issue that some other contemporary approaches discard as uninteresting or even optional. So at least for historical criticism, there's some sense that this text is grounded to something in reality, whereas many modern interpretive methods discard that idea entirely. Social science criticism is interesting. It's become a much more common approach recently and has, as the chapter you will read notes, some benefits and some limits. Again, as a guard against the kind of a theological docetism, I think it has some value. It reminds us that these are real people. There are real social realities that shape the author as well as the reader, and those are part of the communicative process. So it's interesting. There are social science-oriented commentaries and research programs. At the very least, you need to be aware of ways in which this approach might shed light on the work you are doing, and also the way it might shape or influence resources you're consulting as you do research, both helpfully and sometimes unhelpfully. So anyway, this is just a quick introduction to kind of a couple broad range of approaches, and you'll just have to process them as best as you can from that brief overview. Chapter 6 is on traditional historical criticism, and that's a kind of a more troublesome area. I tend to be pretty suspicious of work that focuses on things other than the final form of the text because it's speculative and often has what I would call an evidence light perspective. Q is a great example of one of those things. It's hard to know if it's even worth talking about. Was there a source Q that was used by Matthew and Luke in their writing that floated around the early church? No one ever refers to it. No one's ever seen it, and so on. and yet there are whole commentaries. You can buy commentaries on Q. All this research done on something we've never seen. Is that really worth doing? What if it's not there? But nevertheless, this approach is part of the larger scholarly discussion, so you need to be acquainted with it. So that's why you're reading this, even though I tend to be fairly suspicious of many of the conclusions that come out of it. Chapter 8 on genre analysis hits at one of the most important topics in New Testament interpretation and in hermeneutics in general. This is one that is often misunderstood, improperly employed, or otherwise mangled. Most of us are probably generally familiar with the letter or epistolary genre, and some ways that knowing about that, knowing that this is a letter, is of assistance in interpretation, right? We know this is a letter, we know it's responding to something or writing to a particular context, and so there are certain strategies we use to read a letter that we might not use to read history or poetry. Similarly, in poetry, we have to be aware of poetic form, and structures, and those sorts of things. I don't know how we avoid that. I mean, I think inevitably we're doing that, and I know that some evangelicals have been quite resistant to thinking about genre, but it just seems to me that it's a lost cause, at least if we want to take Scripture seriously as not merely a divine document, but as a human and divine document, which it claims to be. We'll be looking later, especially at the gospel genre. You'll be reading a book on that and be thinking about that. That'll be important. That's a narrative question. And how we read narrative, that's really a big issue and really a dire need, I think, in many evangelical circles, that we read narrative better. So we'll also, I hope, spend a little bit of time in the residency talking about apocalyptic. So we'll try to hit at least the big New Testament categories somewhere along the way. You'll be reading on the Gospels, and we'll be discussing that. This in the rhetoric and other readings, you'll talk a little bit of epistolary material, and we'll talk a little bit about apocalyptic. So hopefully we'll get most of that. And that doesn't even get to the issue that many New Testament books include a blend of genre materials, which we won't be able to talk about. So there's poetry embedded, there's proverbs and parables and other narratives embedded in, say, works that aren't primarily narrative. So all of those things are part of this genre discussion. And it's really important. And again, this will just give you kind of a quick overview. We'll be exploring some of this in more detail later. Chapter 9 provides a brief introduction to rhetorical criticism and its breadth and variety. I won't say a lot about this because we're going to, in this chapter, because we're going to be talking more broadly about rhetoric from our reading from Ben Witherington. And you'll read a whole book on rhetoric just because I think it's an interesting topic and it's worth being aware of this material. This book is a good introduction to one of the main axes of Witherington's scholarly writings. He's one of the most prolific New Testament scholars out there. He's published a ton of stuff, and rhetoric has been one of his focuses. There's this whole series of what he calls socio-rhetorical commentaries, which cover most but not all of the New Testament, and have a distinctive approach where they're thinking very much in terms of rhetorical categories, ancient rhetoric, and assuming that because this was something that was widely known, it was known not just by educated people, but it was implicitly known, at least even by uneducated people, because this is how people communicated in the ancient world. We miss something by not reading Scripture with some awareness of these categories. I remember when I was first introduced to his Corinthians commentary, Conflict and Community in Corinth. And among other things I recall from that first reading, many years ago now, is how he argued for the unity of 2 Corinthians, convincingly, I think, based on its rhetorical structure. That is, if you're familiar in 2 Corinthians, there's been a lot of debate about whether 2 Corinthians was one letter or two letters, or maybe in parts of three letters stitched together. And many scholars have argued that, like, 2 Corinthians 8 and 9 doesn't belong there, and 10 to 13 is separate, and all that. Because the tone is so different, they seem to be going in different directions at first glance. He's very friendly in 1 through 7, and in 10 through 13, he's very strident and calling people names and things like that. And 8 and 9 is about a collection for an offering. How do those all connect? Anyway, what Witherington does, and he's not the only person who does this. I think the commentary in the Sacra series does a very similar kind of thing. He argues that this was not just some random group of texts slung together. In fact, this is part of a deliberate rhetorical strategy that would be used in the ancient world, and that people would recognize that. It wouldn't have been foreign to them. And if that's the case, then 2 Corinthians actually has a cohesive, unitary rhetorical strategy which demonstrates it was indeed a single book. I was persuaded anyway. Maybe I'm wrong, but that. The book we are reading on rhetoric is a distillation of key themes from many of these commentaries. He's covered most of the New Testament, in addition to producing very interesting biblical theology, ethical work in 2 volumes called The Indelible Image. So again, he's written commentaries, but he's also done a little biblical theology, New Testament ethics kind of work. So an important voice, someone you should be familiar with, and this is a good exposure, at least to the way he writes and some of his material. There are many things I could remark on about rhetoric. Let me reduce them to 3 points, I guess, 3 kind of general areas to think about. Witherington challenges the role of epistolary genre in determining the meaning of New Testament epistles. So, traditionally we learn there's an introduction, a body, and the closing, blah, 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 and that's how we interpret the book. Witherington argues that this is wrong, so he's trying to overturn much of our traditional evangelical understanding. And I think on the whole, he's right. To say something is body text is not to say anything about its argument. What kind of body is it? There are different kinds of bodies. And if you look at different different epistles throughout the New Testament, they're quite different. Some of Paul's letters making just direct arguments, but the book of Hebrews is quite different. 1 John is quite different. They're more direct. 1 John has this kind of a circular, recurring thematic kind of movement. All of that. The point is they don't follow the same pattern. So to say it's a letter or an epistle does not really help us know how to interpret it. But even for others, say Romans, the rather generic and unhelpful body that we use in a traditional analysis of letters is not that meaningful. It doesn't tell us much about the meaning or structure of the argument. So you can read and see what you think. Witherington's arguing rhetoric helps us do that. Sometimes I think he might be right. Sometimes he's probably wrong. But if we don't know anything about rhetoric or how it works, we will have trouble appreciating the arguments and evaluating them. A second thing from Witherington I just want to highlight is his discussion of the Gospels, and he focuses mostly on Mark and Luke and the speeches in Acts. There are lots of interesting observations. It's striking. He doesn't include Matthew, but he's never written a commentary on Matthew. That might be part of why. Next week, you'll want to compare Witherington's analysis of Luke in terms of genre as compared to the more standard gospel genre category used by Pennington. Is Luke an outlier? Does the combination of Luke and Acts create a different overall genre or rhetorical strategy? I don't expect you to be able to repeat each argument made by Witherington, but think carefully through several examples in each area to see how his approach works and to think about its effectiveness and see if this is an area you might want to explore further in your future research. You'll notice that in his book on rhetoric, there are several books that aren't mentioned. Matthew, as I mentioned, he hasn't done a commentary here. There's not really much discussion of Matthew. He did do a commentary in a different series, but not a socio-rhetorical one. Craig Keener has done a socio-rhetorical commentary on Matthew, so that would be an interesting contrast in approaches. And Revelation is also not included. And again, he did a brief commentary on Revelation in a Cambridge series, but it's not as intensively rhetorical. There is a brief video clip that I have from Witherington, which talks about rhetoric in Revelation. Maybe I'll share it in the residency if we have time, but it's brief and doesn't really advance this topic too much. So maybe he doesn't cover everything. So that may be a gap or a flaw in his discussion. Nonetheless, he alerts us to a whole area, and there's some interesting debate on rhetoric. Perhaps I'll share a couple articles with you on that if we get time for that. In the end, the final chapter, Withering tries to summarize and explain the significance of this kind of rhetorical analysis. So we have to decide, will rhetoric transform our understanding of the New Testament? For many years it was used highly. It kind of drifted into obscurity, and it's had kind of a renewal in the past couple of decades. What do you make of it? What do you think? Something for us to explore together. Now, one last thing. Let me step outside of Witherington for just one more brief example of how rhetoric might shape our understanding. There's a book that came out a few years ago, which I picked up and read and found very interesting. Stuart Parson wrote a book, Ancient Apostolic Exegesis, which is a study of the writing of a man named Theophilus, who was a late 2nd century apologist. And there are a lot of questions about Theophilus's arguments and whether they're coherent and on all of that. He's been criticized widely. The relevant point for us here is Parsons uses rhetorical analysis to defend Theophilus against common criticisms made of him. In other words, he argues if we understand ancient rhetoric, we realize what Theophilus is doing makes sense in that context, using those tools. It's not an outlier. It's not kind of off-the-wall stuff. It makes sense. And it helps us then to better understand his writing. For example, Theophilus doesn't speak a lot about Jesus or salvation and focuses instead on the Old Testament and its reliability, and that's caused some people some problems. But Parsons argues that this is best understood as a rhetorical strategy. It's not a theological failure on Theophilus' part. The key point here is, once again, it's a recovery of rhetorical awareness may be an aid to interpretation. And so again, without knowing rhetoric extensively, we might struggle to be able to even evaluate Parsons' argument. But the point is that there is an argument from the nature and structure of rhetoric that may rehabilitate or explain texts that otherwise might seem problematic in some way. So anyway, those are a few thoughts on rhetoric. And just again, an introduction. You'll be reading and exploring. We'll be discussing these things during the week. Hopefully this will help get you started and give you a framework for exploring these things throughout the week. As always, let me know if you have any questions, you need to discuss anything, if I can help in any way. We'll see you soon. Bye-bye.